He fired her, called her clumsy, called her worthless, said she was too dumb to be a threat. 1 hour later, she was the only reason his children were still breathing, and the most feared man on the East Coast stood in his own hallway, gun in hand, empire in ruins, and finally said the 4 words that had never once crossed his lips: "I was wrong about you." This is a channel for stories where love hits harder than bullets, mafia power, family bonds, and the quiet strength that changes everything. Remember this: true power is never loud. It waits, it watches, and when the moment comes, it does not miss. Hit like if this already has your attention. Subscribe and bring a friend. We drop a new story every day.
Now, let's go back 8 months to a room with no windows in Connecticut, where an old man pushed a photo of two 7-year-old twins across a table and asked a woman haunted by her past to take on the one job she swore she would never fail at again. The room had the scent of old wood and cold steel. Alara sat at the head of a long table, her hands resting on the scratched surface. The only illumination was a single cone of light from a lamp hanging overhead. The rest of the room was lost in shadow. A projector hummed quietly, displaying the faces of two children on the opposite wall. They were 7 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed far too old for their age. The boy, Asher, held himself perfectly straight, as if he had already been taught that showing any weakness was a privilege he could not afford. The girl, Marin, had a huge grin, a missing front tooth, and one small hand raised as if she was waving at the person taking the picture. Alara stared at that smile and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The man on the other side of the table started to speak. His voice was deep and steady, but you could hear the faint cracks of old age and deep exhaustion in it. "Asher and Marin Calloway," he said. "They are the only son and daughter of Ree Calloway. They have been targets for at least 2 rival crime families ever since their mother was murdered." Alara examined the picture closely. Asher was wearing a uniform, but someone had neglected to fix his collar. Marin was the total opposite. Her dress was rumpled, and her knees were smudged with dirt, a clear sign she had been pulled away from playing for the photo. The two children were completely different from each other, but they both had the same look in their eyes. It was the look of kids who had already figured out that every adult they met wanted something from them. "What is the current threat level?" she asked. "The highest it has ever been," Hugh Calloway replied. His face remained in the darkness, but Ada had already reviewed his file. He was the retired patriarch, the old king who had given up his throne to a son he had lost all respect for. The projector changed to a new photograph. It showed a young woman with dark brown hair, a warm smile, and kind eyes. "Lydia," Hugh said, and for the first moment his voice wavered. "My son's wife. She was killed 2 years ago in an attack that was meant for Ree. The bullet was not for her, but she was the one who died." He paused for a moment. "Since that day, my son has believed that cameras, guns, and wealth can protect everyone. He surrounds himself with bodyguards, installs countless cameras, and turns his home on the 62nd floor into a fortress. But he lacks the wisdom to see that the same men who fear him will betray him as soon as they get a better offer." "Are you positive your son has no idea you are hiring me?" Alara asked. A brief silence followed, as if Hugh disliked what he had to say next. "Ree operates under the belief that money can buy loyalty. He has guards, cameras, and guns. What he does not have is the sense to recognize danger when it comes from inside his own circle." Ara leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "You have already tried the standard approaches, like security upgrades and placing informants on his team." Hugh sighed deeply. "I have exhausted every logical solution, so now I am resorting to an illogical one: a nanny." Those 2 words filled the space between them. Ara almost cracked a smile. "You want me inside the home, right next to the children, even closer than their father. You want me to act like a fool so that everyone lets their guard down around me." Hugh nodded his head slowly, and then his voice grew softer. Tell me about your background. Ara was quiet for a beat. I am an orphan. I entered the foster system when I was 4 years old. I lived with 7 different families in 9 years, but none of them ever felt like a real home. I joined the military at 18. I worked in intelligence, served 2 tours, then left for private contract work. I have no family, no permanent home, and no one waiting for me to return. She said it all in the same detached tone someone would use to read a shopping list. But Hugh understood what she was not saying. He put the image of the twins back on the wall. Ara looked at Marin, at her gap-toothed grin, at her small, raised hand, and a painful memory surfaced without any warning. Another little girl, much younger, with messy blonde hair, was huddled on the floor of a dark foster home. A 13-year-old Alara was holding her foster sister, trying to protect her with her own small body, but she had not been strong enough or fast enough. She had not been enough to save her. That little girl did not make it through the night, and Ada had carried that failure with her every day since. She swallowed hard and asked, "What is the objective?" Hugh replied, 12 months. I need that much time to finalize a peace treaty with the other families. I do not care if my son is still in charge, in jail, or dead by then. What matters is that the children are still alive. Alara considered the dangers, the unknown factors, and the cost of spending 12 months in enemy territory, living with a man who would hate her from the moment they met. I require complete operational control, she stated. If a situation arises where I must choose between his ego and the safety of his children, I will not hesitate. He will, Hugh answered, and that is precisely why I am hiring you. He slid a folder across the table toward her. It contained her new identity papers, fabricated records from a nanny service, and a fake history that transformed her into Alara Voss, a mediocre caregiver with a bland resume. The folder also included photos of her uniform, a simple gray outfit designed to make her blend into the background. One last thing, Hugh added. If my son even begins to suspect you are more than you seem, he will not just fire you, he will have you buried, and I mean that literally. Then I will make certain he has no reason to be suspicious, she said. Hugh stood up, his chair scraping against the floorboards. It is not about him not suspecting. It is about him looking at you and seeing only what he expects to see, someone small, insignificant, and not worth a second thought. You need to prove him wrong, but be careful not to prove it to him too early. Ada closed the folder. Beyond the walls, if the room had any windows, the sun would have been rising soon. She got to her feet and took one final look at the twins' photograph on the wall. Marin was still grinning. Asher was still standing tall. And Alara, for the first time in many years, felt something besides the usual emptiness she always felt when she saw the face of a child. She gave Hugh a nod and then left the room without a backward glance. The safe house in Brooklyn smelled like stale paint and old, leaking pipes. Ada stood in the bathroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror, a bottle of light brown hair dye on the counter. Her naturally black hair was cut neatly to her shoulders, a practical style for someone who had never wanted to draw attention to herself. Now she pulled it back, applied the dye, and tied it into a simple loose knot. It was not a polished look like the women Ree Calloway knew, but it was neat, the way someone who was used to tying with her own clothing. First, she worked on her posture. Standing in the center of the living room, her bare feet felt the cold wood floor as she intentionally slumped her shoulders and allowed her spine to curve into a slouch. She practiced a slightly unbalanced walk, with each step falling just a little slower than the one before, making it seem like she could lose her footing at any second. This entire transformation felt wrong and fought against all her natural training. "Just do it," she whispered, taking several steps before catching her toe on a rug that was not there. She made sure the resulting stumble appeared clumsy and not at all practiced. After that, She arranged a set of cheap plates in a line on the kitchen counter. She picked them up individually and walked across the room, purposely bumping a chair just hard enough to send each plate crashing to the ground. The sharp sound of breaking ceramic echoed in the quiet apartment. The first time, her muscles tightened automatically. The second time, the reaction was weaker. By the 10th plate, her hands were steady as she gathered the shattered fragments. She had perfected the delicate line between awkward and benign. It was never so much that it seemed deliberate, but always enough to be an annoyance. Finally, she took out the uniform, a simple gray wrap shirt with matching pants that were plain and functional. At first look, she appeared to be a nanny or a live-in housekeeper, the kind of person who is easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. But the wide black belt secured tightly at her waist suggested something else entirely. She stared at her reflection, her fingers touching the knot. Hugh suggested she could take it off to better disappear into the role, to conceal herself completely, but the belt was her anchor. It served as the last line between the character she was playing and the woman she was inside. He is looking for someone who seems weak, she thought. I will let him think I am weak, but I will always know my own strength. Tucked securely beneath the fabric, the black belt stayed on. Before leaving, she paused at her nightstand. A small, dented tin box was there, next to a key and some loose change. She lifted the lid. Inside lay an old instant photo, its colors faded with age. Two little girls stood in front of a foster home, dressed in cheap Halloween outfits from a thrift store. The older one wore a witch hat made of cardboard. The younger one was draped in a cape made from a black plastic trash bag. They were both smiling with the kind of pure happiness that only children can find when there is no logical reason to be happy. That was Ara at 12 years old with her 5-year-old foster sister. It was taken 1 year before her world fell apart. Her fingers gently traced the face of the little girl in the photograph. She did not speak the child's name, because she had not allowed that name to pass her lips in 14 years. But she whispered to the empty room, "This time will be different." She placed the photo into the chest pocket of her shirt, right over her heart, so she could feel its sharp corner with every breath she took. Then she shut the tin box and buried it at the bottom of her suitcase along with every other item that defined her true self. When she finally walked out of her apartment, her shoulders were already slouched, her eyes were filled with fake fear, and her hand trembled just slightly on the suitcase handle. Any person who passed her on the Brooklyn street that morning would have only noticed a normal young woman, maybe a bit shy and awkward, the kind of person you see and immediately forget. But under the black belt, beneath the gray uniform, and behind the timid eyes, her inner resolve was as strong as steel. The lobby of Callaway Tower was a silent space of glass and gleaming marble that reflected her borrowed shoes. 2 bodyguards flanked the private elevator. They wore black suits and scanned her with the indifferent expressions of men who had seen hundreds of other applicants come and go. "Name?" one of them grunted. Voss," she stammered, making her voice crack. "From Sunlight Care, for the nanny job." The guard glanced at his tablet and then gave a curt nod. "Top floor." The elevator was all mirrors and played soft jazz. Ara watched herself in the glass, noting her rounded shoulders, how her hands gripped the folder too hard, and the way her eyes were just a little too wide. The doors opened with a soft whoosh, and the silence was overwhelming. The 62nd floor penthouse was even more imposing than it appeared in the pictures Hugh had shown her. Windows from floor to ceiling displayed the Manhattan skyline, a glittering world of neon and steel that seemed like a distant galaxy. The inside was furnished with clean lines and light-colored fabrics. It was the type of pristine space that challenges you not to leave a single mark. A woman in a fitted black dress and high heels stood near the entrance. "Miss Voss," she said with a sharp tone. "I am Miss Voss," she said with a sharp tone. "I am Miss Voss," she said with a sharp tone. "I am Miss Voss," she said with a sharp tone. "I am Miss Voss," she said with a sharp tone. "I am Miss Voss," she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she said with a sharp tone. I am Miss Voss, she. Ray's Calloway was standing by the glass wall, a phone in his hand, his black suit coat open over a crisp white shirt without a tie. He held himself with the casual confidence of someone who is always in charge. Two bodyguards stood near him like silent statues. On a long couch beside them, Asher was reading a book that looked thicker than he was, his back perfectly straight and his feet dangling above the floor. A few feet away, Marin was lying on her stomach, focused on her crayon drawing, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth, her paper covered in bright colors. "Sir," Mrs. Thornton announced, "your 10 o'clock appointment is here." Ray's finished his call without turning around. He slipped the phone into his pocket before he finally looked at Ada, his gaze sweeping over her in a single, dismissive motion. He noted the uniform, the folder, and the nervous way she held it. His face showed no sign that he was impressed. "Ara Voss," he stated. "Yes, sir," she answered, her voice deliberately shaky. "Thank you for your time," she continued. "The agency mentioned you have worked for important families, like celebrities and business leaders." "Yes, sir," she said. "Mainly, managing schedules, preparing meals, and helping with homework. I am very good with routines." "Routines?" he echoed, his voice dripping with boredom. "Can you perform under pressure, Miss Voss?" "Of course, sir. I certainly try to." She moved toward the coffee table to give him her file, but she miscalculated the space just enough for the folder to hit a crystal vase. The vase wobbled and rattled on the glass tabletop. She gasped and reached for it, her fingers clumsy. "I am so sorry. I am so very sorry," she stammered. The vase did not topple over, but the noise had served its purpose. One of the bodyguards let out a quiet scoff. Mrs. Thornton's lips formed a tight line of disapproval. Race's eyes narrowed and he shot a look at Mrs. Thornton, a silent confirmation of a shared thought. "You are trembling," he pointed out. "Yes, sir," she said without hesitation. "It is just that everything here is so large and so very high up." He glanced at the wall of windows and then back at her. "You have a fear of heights." A small one, she replied with a weak smile. But I can adjust. He accepted the folder from her but did not open it. Why did your last employer let you go? Ada looked down at her feet and shifted uncomfortably. The mother felt I was too firm about screen time. The children were not happy about it. I was trying to enforce her rules, but I suppose I was too inflexible. Marin's head popped up for a second before she went back to her drawing. Too firm about screen time, Race said flatly. We are not negotiating a peace treaty here, Miss Voss. I understand, sir. I just want to ensure the children are safe. That statement hung in the air with unexpected seriousness. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Race tossed the folder onto the table. Can you cook? Yes, sir. Yes. Simple meals. Do you know any other languages? I know basic Spanish, sir. Enough for schoolwork and normal conversation. Do you have a criminal record? No, sir. Any political affiliations or involvement with any underground groups? No, sir, she said, letting the weight of the truth hide behind that simple denial. Mrs. Thornton coughed lightly. Sir, we do have other candidates scheduled for interviews. Race ignored her. His eyes remained fixed on Ada, as if he were deciding something important. Ada let her shoulders droop even more. She made sure her feet were not perfectly aligned. Her entire posture was meant to signal that she was not a danger. Finally, he shrugged. Fine. The agency was recommended by a colleague, and she seems too simple-minded to be a threat. Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a nearly imperceptible reaction. Hire her, he commanded, already turning his attention back to the city view. If she damages anything valuable, take it out of her salary. The interview was clearly finished. Ara hid the victorious glint in her eyes. Thank you, sir. I promise I will not let you down. He did not respond, or even look back. As Mrs. Thornton escorted her down a long corridor to go over the house rules, Ara cast a quick glance toward the children. Marin looked up from her artwork, cocked her head, and stared directly at Ara's waist. You wear a black belt, like in the karate movies, the little girl observed. Ara managed a clumsy smile. Oh, I just like the color black. Marin scrunched up her nose, looking unconvinced, before returning to her crayons. But on the couch, Asher never lifted his gaze from his book. He did not need to. He had been watching her since the moment she walked in. His eyes tracked her down the hall until she vanished around the corner, and in his stare, there was no trace of childhood innocence. There was only calculation. The boy did not believe her act for a second. For the entire first week, Ada was a shadow, observing everything. She learned the rhythms of the penthouse, just like a person learns the rhythm of their own breathing. She memorized the schedules of the bodyguards, figuring out who genuinely watched the security monitors and who just took a quick peek before zoning out on their phone until their shift was over. In the sitting room, she located a blind spot where the angles of two cameras failed to meet, creating a tiny space just big enough for someone to stand completely unseen. She also studied Reese's comings and goings, how he would arrive from the private elevator at unpredictable times each night. He often smelled of expensive whiskey, but sometimes a faint scent of gunpowder clung to his clothes, a sign that he had been close to some kind of violence. She learned to read his anger. Whenever tensions in his criminal world escalated and phone calls ran late into the night, the entire penthouse would feel wound tight the next day. The staff moved with more caution. Mrs. Thornton became quieter, and the two children would retreat into themselves, like little creatures who already knew that survival meant becoming invisible. Ada saw every detail but showed nothing. Around Asher and Marin, she acted clumsy but reliable. She pretended to forget the way to the library on 2 separate occasions and even bumped into a small table in the hall. She dropped Asher's textbook, sending papers flying across the floor. "Oh, I am so sorry," she said over and over, getting on her knees to pick them up. "My brain just moves too fast for my hands sometimes." Asher knelt down to help her, carefully gathering the pages and putting them back in order. The boy gave her a slight frown, as if her explanation bothered him for a reason he could not quite figure out. But Marin was the complete opposite. Marin was a chatterbox. She talked constantly, as if she was afraid silence might just swallow her whole. On her third evening there, as Ada read a bedtime story at the edge of Marin's bed, the little girl cut her off mid-sentence. "Mommy read to me too," Marin said, her voice suddenly soft. She was sad, but not like grown-ups are sad. It was a kid kind of sad. Simple and without any filters. "Mommy was a better reader than you. Not that you are bad, but she knew how to do the monster voice right." Ada felt a lump form in her throat. She replied gently, "I am sure your mommy was wonderful. Just wonderful." Marin nodded. "Daddy never does. He always says he is too busy, but I really think he just does not know how to make his voice sound like a monster." Ada felt a tiny crack form in her heart. It wasn't a loud break, just a small fracture she knew would never heal. She continued the story, but this time she did the monster voice. Marin let out a real laugh before she finally fell asleep, holding onto Ara's finger with her small hand. With Asher, there was more of a distance. The boy did not open up to people easily. He observed her from a distance, always polite, but never friendly. He would answer her questions, but never offered any extra information. Ara did not pressure him. She just showed up on time each morning, helped him pack his school bag, and gave him little exercises disguised as games. She would ask him to circle all the exits on a drawing of a park, or to draw the quickest route from a little boy to the best hiding spot. He completed the tasks without questioning them, as if he understood on some level that there were certain things you just needed to know, even if nobody ever told you why. Then late one night near the end of her second week, a quiet knock came at her door. Ada opened it to find Asher standing there in his striped pajamas, his hair a mess, and his eyes wide in the dark hallway. "Are you afraid of the dark?" he asked her. No hello, no explanation. Ada studied him for a second. "Yes," she said. "I am." The boy blinked, as if that was the one answer he had not expected to hear. "But I know how to just sit in the darkness until my eyes get used to it." Ada continued. She sat down on the floor right by the doorway. Asher looked at her, then at the dark room behind her, and then he sat down right next to her. He did not say another word. He did not explain why he had come or ask any more questions. They just sat together in the silence, their backs resting against the wall, listening to the faint sounds of the city's 62 floors below. After about 15 minutes, his head leaned over onto her shoulder as his breathing became slow and even. His eyes were closed. He was asleep. Ada remained perfectly still for a little while, afraid to wake him, before she gently lifted him into her arms. Asher felt much lighter than she thought he would, and she could feel his sharp shoulder blades through his pajamas, like tiny wings that were not yet strong enough to let him fly. She placed him in his bed, pulled the covers up to his chin, and fixed his pillow. While he was sleeping, the constant guarded look on the boy's face disappeared. In that one moment, he looked like a normal 7-year-old for the very first time since she had arrived. Ada stood by his bed, looking down at him. A single phrase echoed in her mind like a steady beat. "Do not get attached. Do not get attached. Do not get attached." She quietly left the room, closing the door without making a sound. She leaned her back against the wall in the hallway and closed her eyes. But she knew it was already too late. She could feel the photograph in her pocket pressing against her, a constant reminder that the last time she let herself get attached, it had cost her everything. Bianca Calloway showed up at the penthouse on a weekday afternoon with no warning at all. It was the kind of entrance a person makes when they believe they never need to announce themselves. The private elevator doors slid open, and she entered the living room as if she were walking onto a stage. She had a designer purse hooked on her arm, and her high heels clicked against the stone floor like a drumbeat. The smell of her expensive perfume announced her arrival before she ever said a word. Mrs. Thornton was standing near the kitchen counter, and Ara immediately noticed her posture was a little more rigid than normal. The house manager was not scared of Reese, but Bianca's presence changed something in her. It was not fear, but more like her patience was being pushed to its absolute limit. Ara was on the floor with Marin. The little girl's face lit up for a moment, but her smile vanished as soon as Bianca leaned in and scowled at her hair. "This child looks like she slept on a park bench," Bianca snapped, pulling a loose strand from the neat bun Ara had so carefully made. "Has it really been 8 months? You would think the nanny would have learned how to properly brush a little girl's hair by now." Ara felt her jaw clench, a reaction she instantly suppressed. She bowed her head and slumped her shoulders. "I apologize, Miss Calloway. I was styling it the way Marin asked, but I will redo it immediately." But Marin was quicker. The little girl shot to her feet, hands on her hips, her chin tilted up in a way Ara knew all too well. It was just like Reese. "Ara does my hair much prettier than you do," Marin declared, her voice ringing with the bold confidence only a 7-year-old possesses. "At least Ara asks me what I want." The room fell silent. Mrs. Thornton shut her eyes for a brief moment. On the couch, Asher flipped a page in his book, but Ara saw that his eyes were not actually reading. He was listening intently. Bianca's face turned white, while a blotchy red rash crept up her neck. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut before turning on Ara with a familiar expression. It was the look of someone needing to unleash their fury on a person who could not fight back. "Did you teach her to speak that way?" Bianca demanded. Bianca hissed through her teeth. Alara gently guided Marin behind her in a movement that was soft but firm. Marin apologized to Miss Bianca. The little girl pouted but still mumbled an apology that was clearly not sincere. Alara turned back to Bianca, lowering her eyes and making her shoulders seem small. "I am sorry, Miss Calloway. I will be more careful." Bianca held her gaze for another moment, weighing if Alara was even worth her anger, before deciding she was not important enough to stay upset about. She spun on her heel and her shoes clicked down the hall toward Reese's room. She called out her brother's name as if the entire penthouse was her own private living room. Alara watched her leave and made a mental note. Bianca was not just some arrogant relative stopping by. In the next 20 minutes, Alara counted 3 different people Bianca called and invited to the penthouse for the weekend. None of them went through security checks, and none were approved by Mrs. Thornton. Bianca brought complete strangers into the Calloway home like it was a local coffee shop, and nobody dared to stop her because she shared the Calloway name. When Bianca finally left 2 hours later, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and a heavy silence, Alara was in the kitchen washing dishes. It was then she realized she had found the biggest security risk in the entire penthouse. It was not the cameras, or the blind spots, or even the lazy bodyguards. The biggest threat wore high heels, carried a designer handbag, and Reese. Calloway would never see it because it was his own flesh and blood. The first time Alara nearly died happened on a cloudy Saturday afternoon. The plan was supposed to be simple. They were spending the afternoon at a private playground in Central Park meant only for the children of the very rich. It was a place where parents and nannies sat on perfectly clean benches, sipped espresso, and made small talk while their kids played on gleaming slides and climbing structures. The security perimeter had already been checked. All the cameras were working. 2 of Reese's bodyguards were posted near the main gate and along the fence. On paper, everything looked perfectly safe. But only on paper. Alara sat on a bench near the jungle gym with a cup of hot coffee in her hands, her eyes constantly scanning the area. Marin was on the swings, her little legs kicking at the air as her laughter carried on the wind. Asher was climbing the steps of the jungle gym with careful, exact movements. He looked more like a child learning a dance routine than a boy just playing. No one was pushing him, no one was calling his name. He was playing all by himself, with the kind of skill that comes from being used to it. Alara did not like that one bit. Then, her eyes landed on him. He was a man, about 35 years old, wearing a baseball cap pulled down low and a gray hoodie that looked completely out of place among the other parents in their cashmere coats and leather shoes. He was standing near the gate, just a little too still. His eyes were not wandering across the playground with the relaxed distraction of a parent. They were mapping out locations, noting entrances and exits, the path from the jungle gym to the parking lot, and the distance from the swings to the north fence. Alara took a slow sip of her coffee and shifted her position on the bench to get a better view. One of Reese's two bodyguards was standing about 10 meters away, chatting with a mother who was carrying a designer bag. His shoulders were relaxed, and he was smiling. The other bodyguard was busy scrolling on his phone by the gate. Neither of them had noticed the man in the cap. He made his move with perfect timing. Just as two other children ran into each other near the swings and started crying, the man slipped between two benches. His movements were smooth and calm as he headed directly for the bottom of the jungle gym stairs, right where Asher was climbing down. Alara stood up so fast that her ankle hit the edge of the bench. The sound made a few people look over. She let her ankle twist as she stumbled on the grass. "Oh!" she cried out. The coffee cup flew out of her hand, sailing through the air in a perfect arc. The lid popped off in mid-flight, sending a spray of scalding liquid directly at the man in the cap. He saw it coming too late. The hot coffee splashed all over his chest and face. He jumped back, covering his eyes with one hand, while a curse hissed from his mouth. "I am so sorry," Alara gasped, rushing toward him with her hands waving around as if she was in a complete panic. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I tripped." Behind her, the bodyguard finally looked away from the crying children. He took in the entire scene, the stranger cursing in pain, Alara fumbling around, Asher frozen halfway down the stairs. Finally, his professional training kicked in. His hand quickly moved inside his suit jacket, reaching for the holster hidden there. The man in the cap recovered much faster than a normal person would have. His eyes darted from Alara to Asher, cold calculations happening behind them. For a split second, he considered if he should continue his plan. Then he saw the bodyguard's hand and the glint of leather. He turned away with another muffled curse and walked quickly toward the gate, steam still rising from his shirt. "Watch where you are going next time," he yelled over his shoulder. "I am sorry," Alara repeated, bowing her head slightly. The bodyguard moved to stand between Asher and the retreating stranger, helping the boy down from the stairs. "Who was that?" he asked. "Just someone I spilled coffee on," Alara said quietly. "I am such a disaster." The bodyguard's eyes remained locked on the man in the cap until he vanished into the parking lot, his jaw set tightly. "Back to the car," he said into his shoulder radio. "Mike, we are leaving right now." As the cars pulled away, Alara caught one last look at the stranger. He was standing next to a silver van, one hand pressed to his chest where the coffee had hit him, his eyes burning with anger as he watched the cars drive away. In the back seat, Asher buckled his own seatbelt without anyone telling him to. "You did that on purpose, did not you?" he whispered. "Did what?" Alara asked. "Threw the coffee." "I tripped," she said, her eyes wide with fake innocence. "I am the clumsiest nanny in New York, remember?" The boy looked at her face closely, as if he was searching for tiny cracks in a perfect mask. "You did not scream until after the coffee already hit him," he said softly. Alara turned her head to look out the window, her faint reflection staring back at her as the city slid by. She hid a small smile that the boy could not see. That evening, when they all returned to the penthouse, Reese was waiting for them in the living room. His suit jacket was off, his sleeves were rolled up, and documents were spread all over the coffee table. Mrs. Thornton stood next to him, her face tense. "How was the playground?" Reese asked without even looking up. The bodyguard answered before Alara could say a word. "There was an incident. A suspicious man got too close to the boy. He left after Miss Voss spilled coffee on him." Reese finally looked up. "Spilled coffee?" Alara winced. "I tripped." "Sir, I am very sorry." "Of course you tripped," he said with a flat voice. You almost got us sued for burning a stranger in the park because you do not know how to walk straight. Next time, my bodyguards will handle things before my nanny has to light someone on fire, Mrs. Thornton. I want you to increase perimeter checks on all outings. And Miss Voss. Yes, sir. You are now forbidden from carrying anything hot when you take the children outside. I do not want to risk you hurting someone and getting us sued. Yes, sir. Reese went back to his papers as if she was no longer in the room. Marin grabbed Alara's hand and pulled her toward the bedroom, talking non-stop about the swings. But Asher walked silently behind them. The boy's eyes never left Alara's back, and in his look there was something new. It was not suspicion anymore. It was something more like the curiosity of a child who was just starting to realize that adults sometimes lie for very good reasons. 2 weeks after the incident in Central Park, a new person joined the penthouse security team. His name was Dylan Hale, and he was 32 years old. He had sharp cheekbones and an easy smile, the kind of smile you would see on the best insurance salesman in town. It was the kind of smile that made you forget to ask how long he had been standing there. He introduced himself to Mrs. Thornton with a polite voice and shook hands with the older guards with a grip that was just the right amount of firm. Within his first hour, he already knew the cook's name, that Mrs. Thornton drank Earl Grey tea, and that the night guard liked to watch basketball on his phone. He knew exactly how to make people feel comfortable, and that was precisely what made Alara so uncomfortable. She watched him from the kitchen while washing the dishes, her hands buried in soapy water, her eyes catching his reflection in the stainless steel cabinet door. Dylan was standing in the hallway, talking to one of the older guards. The conversation seemed perfectly normal, but when he thought no one was looking, his eyes did not scan the windows or the cameras like a regular security guard would. Instead, they slid to the left, toward the children's schedule pinned to the side of the refrigerator. School hours, piano lessons, outdoor playtimes, teachers' names, the address of the music school. His eyes stayed on it for exactly 3 seconds before they went back to the conversation as if nothing had happened. But to Alara, those 3 seconds were like a confession. He caught her looking, or at least he thought he did, because she had already lowered her gaze back to the dishes just a moment before. He walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, that pleasant smile still on his face. "Pretty busy around here, huh?" he said. Alara dried her hands on a towel and gave him a shy smile. The children, sadly, do not know how to plan their naps around the staff meeting schedule. He let out a soft laugh. I will keep that in mind. When he turned to leave, his eyes flickered one more time, so fast it was almost impossible to see, toward the children's bedroom door at the end of the hall. The glance was only for a second, but it was enough. That was all she needed to hear. Ara put the towel down and went into the children's room. Marin sat on the carpet, working on a puzzle, while Asher was at his desk doing homework. She settled on the floor between them, her tone as calm as if she were discussing the forecast. There is a new security guard outside, she said quietly. If he or anyone ever tells you that your father wants you to go somewhere without me, you come and find me immediately. Always. Do you both understand that? Marin glanced up from her puzzle. Why? Because I need to know where you are at all times. You can just call it one of my weird quirks. Marin just shrugged, seemed satisfied with the explanation, and returned to her puzzle. Asher, however, looked over his shoulder at Ara. His pencil paused mid-sentence. Do you think he is a bad person? He asked softly. I think it is never a bad idea to be careful, Ara replied. The boy studied her for another moment before he nodded. Okay. Later that night, after the penthouse was quiet and the only sound was the low hum of the furnace, Ara began to move. Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floors as she glided down the hallway, guided by the dim glow of the security lights. The utility closet was next to the laundry room, its door left unlocked since nobody thought a nanny would ever need to go inside. She located it right away. The Wi-Fi power strip was on a bottom shelf. It was the same model, color, and brand as the original one, but the serial number was not the same. She knelt down, her fingertips tracing the back of the small box. She had memorized the original serial number during her first week while exploring the penthouse late at night. This was a different number. Someone had swapped out the device, and the only purpose for replacing it with an identical-looking one was to conceal something inside. Something impossible to see with a casual glance. It had to be a hidden transmitter, piggybacking on the network to steal data from cameras, microphones, and calendars. Basically everything transmitted over the penthouse Wi-Fi. Taking it apart would reveal her suspicions, but she could destroy it. Rising to her feet, she went back into the hall and grabbed a mop and bucket from the laundry room. She started cleaning the floor, moving slowly from the hallway toward the utility closet. Her motions were completely normal, just mopping back and forth. And then she stumbled. The bucket overturned, and water gushed across the floor, flooding the shelf and drenching the power strip and all its wires. A loud sizzle of a short circuit echoed in the small space, followed by the distinct smell of burning plastic. "Oh my gosh," she whispered into the darkness, making her voice sound just frightened enough to be convincing. The next morning, an information technology specialist was in the hall, muttering curses as he examined the mess. The whole wireless network was down, overnight. The rotor was fried, the power strip was soaked, some of the backup files were gone forever. One of the security guards standing close by looked sick, his eyes glued to the damaged gear, with the look of a man who had lost something important that he could never report. Ara stood with them, wringing her hands with wide, innocent eyes. "I had no idea the bucket was so full. I promise I was just cleaning the floors. I am so, so sorry." Mrs. Thornton let out a long sigh. The tech just shook his head. Later, when Mrs. Thornton told Reese about what happened, he did not even look up from his phone. "She does not notice anything," he said, his voice completely empty of emotion. But she did notice. She noticed everything. Ara picked the perfect time to probe, waiting until Mrs. Thornton was by herself in the kitchen. The house manager was looking over some bills, her glasses perched on her nose, and her pen tapping a thoughtful beat on the counter. Ara entered the room, twisting her hands as if she were nervous. "Mrs. Thornton," she said in a quiet voice, "I have seen a few things that seem a little odd." The house manager kept her eyes on the papers. "What kind of things?" "Mr. Hale, the new guard. He was away from his post by the elevator for nearly 5 minutes last week. Also, the sensor on the kitchen side door was off all weekend. It might have been an accident, but I am not certain. I know it is not my business, but—" Mrs. Thornton placed her pen down with a quiet little sound. She looked up, her glasses reflecting the light, and studied Ara with a look that was both gentle and stern. "Miss Voss," she said, "your responsibility is the children. You should let the security team handle security matters. I understand that. My only concern is for Asher and Marin." Mrs. Thornton's expression softened just a little. "We all worry about them, but if you begin to question the security staff, they will not like it. That could be unsafe for both you and the children. Do you see what I mean?" "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." Ara dipped her head and retreated from the kitchen, acting just like someone who had been put in her place. But this conversation only confirmed her suspicions. If Mrs. Thornton, the most perceptive person in the household, did not see an issue, then the threat was either extremely well hidden or had existed for so long that it now seemed normal. That night, as the penthouse fell dark and quiet except for the hum of the private elevator, Ara was on the move again. She had already mapped out every motion sensor, knew exactly which lights were triggered by movement, and understood how to hug the walls to stay in the shadows. Reese's office was at the very end of the East Hall, behind a massive oak door with a secure lock. She did not need to enter the room. She just wanted to confirm what she had noticed the previous night, and it was still the same. The second drawer of Reese's desk, the one with a small, separate key lock, was closed and seemed untouched. But when she aimed a tiny flashlight beam at the drawer, she could see tiny scratches around the keyhole. Someone had picked the lock and re-locked it. They were skilled enough to avoid obvious damage, but not careful enough to notice that the documents inside were out of order. The papers were not arranged according to Reese's specific filing system, a habit Ara had already memorized. Somebody was secretly looking at the Calloway family's private financial information. Next, she went to the kitchen. The key lockbox for the back door, a metal case on the wall that opened with a 4-digit combination, now had new scratches near the opening mechanism. These were not from someone who smoothly entered the code. They were from a person who knew the combination but fumbled with the latch for a split second, a hand that was not used to this particular lock. So, someone had the code who did not normally use that entrance. The pieces were falling into place. A new guard had been hired. A piece of hardware had been secretly replaced. The children's activities were being monitored, private files were being accessed, and the back door was being tested. The danger was not trying to get in. It was already inside. The issue was that Ara could not accuse anyone without revealing her own secrets. If she accused Dylan Hale, she would be forced to explain her evidence. That explanation would get her fired faster than anything else. Reese Calloway did not tolerate people keeping secrets in his home, even if those secrets were meant to keep his family safe. So she did what she always did best. She adapted, she observed, and she pretended to be clueless. She started checking the locks on the children's doors each night. She noted every single tiny change within the penthouse, and she continued to have accidents at just the right times. The following morning, she took Asher and Marin to their school. On the pavement just outside, after Marin dashed through the gate shouting a loud goodbye for everyone to hear, Ara held Asher back for just a moment. "If I ever tell you to make a left turn when we should be going straight, I need you to do it without any questions. Do you understand?" "Why?" the boy asked, not with defiance, but with the tone of a kid who was already familiar with a world full of unexplained rules. "Because sometimes the easiest path is exactly where someone else wants you to go, and I prefer not to give strangers what they are expecting." The boy sighed, glanced left, then right, then forward. "I can see 3 different ways off this street," he stated. "There is the school entrance, the alleyway over there, and the subway stop on the corner." Ara looked at A 7-year-old boy stood on a Manhattan sidewalk, listing escape plans the same way other kids recite a lunch menu. She wasn't sure if she should feel proud or if her heart should break. Perhaps it was a bit of both. "Good," she said. The boy gave a small nod, shifted his backpack, and walked through the school gate, never once looking back. She stayed there, watching, until the doors closed behind him. Then, her shoulders slumped, her eyes fell to the ground, and she transformed back into the clumsy nanny that everyone was accustomed to ignoring. Ree arrived back at the penthouse just before 2 in the morning. The private elevator slid open without a sound, and he stepped into the hall with the exhausted posture of a man running on empty but forcing his body to stay upright. His suit jacket was draped over his arm, and the sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up. The right cuff was smeared with a streak of blood that had already dried to a dark brown. It was not his blood. Not his. He had no visible injuries, at least none that you could see. But his eyes looked hollow, and his left hand still had a faint tremor, a leftover from an adrenaline rush that had not yet faded. It was the residue of whatever took place on those streets the city lights never fully reach. He moved through the unlit sitting room, went past the kitchen, and walked into the hallway that led to the children's rooms. It was a ritual. No matter how late he returned, no matter how much violence the night had demanded, he always walked this hallway before going to his own room. He never entered their rooms or opened their doors. He just passed by and listened for the sound of their breathing through the wood, confirming they were still okay. Only then did he allow himself to finally stand down. But tonight, Marin's bedroom door was slightly ajar. The soft yellow light from her nightlight spilled through the opening, casting a narrow beam across the hallway floor. He paused. Inside the room, she sat in a small armchair next to Marin's bed. A book was open on her lap, and her voice was so quiet, it was almost like she was just shaping her breath into words. She was reading the end of a story that Marin had likely fallen asleep during. But she continued to read, her voice remaining low and steady, as if stopping might shatter something delicate. Marin was snuggled under her blanket. Her face was turned toward Lara's arm. One of her small hands was wrapped around Lara's wrist as she slept. It was the kind of grip a child has when they are scared that the grown-up will disappear if they let go. And there on the rug beside the bed, Asher was curled up, sleeping with his knees drawn up to his chest, his breathing even. No one had told the boy to be there. He had brought his pillow from his room, placed it on the rug, and laid down without a single word, as if he needed to be close, but would rather do anything than actually say it out loud. Ree stood just outside the doorway. His hand, which was still trembling slightly, gripped the wooden frame. The dried blood on his cuff cracked as his fingers tightened. He looked into that room and saw something that no security system, no camera, no bodyguard, and none of the money he had invested in this tower could ever have created. It was peace. Not just safety, but peace. The two were not the same thing, and he had never realized that until this moment. He was standing in his hallway with another person's blood on his shirt, watching a clumsy nanny read to his daughter, while his son slept on the floor just to be near her. Something inside his chest shifted. It was a tiny, almost unnoticeable change, like a door he never knew was locked had just creaked open a tiny bit. It wasn't love. It wasn't trust. It was something closer to gratitude, but he had no name for the feeling because he was not fluent in that kind of language. He stood there for a few more moments before quietly walking away. He didn't say a word. He didn't knock. He gave no sign that he had been there. As he left, his footsteps in the hallway were lighter than when he had arrived, as if he was trying not to disturb the fragile scene he had just witnessed. The next morning, when she opened her bedroom door at 6, a cup of hot coffee was sitting on the floor right in front of it. There was no message and no note, just the coffee. It was black, exactly how she liked it, which was a detail she couldn't recall ever telling anyone. She stared down at it for a second. Then she bent over, picked it up, and took a sip while looking toward the hallway window, where the first light of a Manhattan morning was starting to shine through the glass. She did not smile, but she let herself feel a moment of warmth before snapping back to reality. The man who had left the coffee was the same man who would put her in the ground if he ever found out who she really was. The first warning sign was the silence. It was not the comfortable quiet of a house at rest, but a silence that was stretched thin and tight, like a piano wire. It was the kind of quiet that made the entire penthouse feel like it was holding its breath. The guards talked less. Mrs. Thornton walked with more urgency. Even the sound of the elevator bell seemed sharper. Ara noticed the change in how people's eyes followed her as she walked down the hall. It all started with a watch. This was not just any watch. It was a limited edition watch that Ree kept inside a glass case in his bedroom, right next to the cufflinks that had closed the deal on more than one bloody agreement. He didn't wear it often, but he enjoyed knowing it was there, a reminder that time, much like power, was something that could be owned. One morning, the glass case was open and the watch was gone. The news of its disappearance went off like a small explosion in this penthouse. The guards were brought in, schedules were checked, and security tapes were reviewed frame by frame. The entire staff was lined up in the dining room, their hands clasped and their faces pale. She stood with them, her heartbeat steady and her expression one of confusion. "Last night, 10:32, one of the guards reported, his eyes glued to his tablet. "The boss's bedroom door opened. We saw movement near the glass case. The watch was taken." "And who was it?" Ree asked. His voice was quiet and low, which only made everyone in the room feel more nervous, not less. "Who opened my bedroom door at 10:32? The guard paused. "Miss Voss, sir." Every single person turned to look at her. "That is impossible," she said, making sure to let her voice shake just enough. "I put Marin to bed at 9. I was nowhere near your room after that." The guard tapped the screen of his tablet, and a still photo appeared. It was a grainy, black and white image from the hallway camera. It showed a person in a gray uniform walking toward Ree's bedroom. It was her uniform, her height, and her hairstyle, which was pulled back in a low knot. "Cameras do not lie," another guard muttered. She looked at the image. The posture was close, but it was not quite right. The shoulders were a little too straight. The walk was too precise and even. It was missing the slight off-balance step she had practiced for weeks at the safe house in Brooklyn. Someone had been watching her, studying every move, and then perfected their imitation until it was just similar enough. Close to perfect, but close was not good enough. "I was not there," she stated, her voice remarkably even. "You can ask Marin. I stayed in her room until she fell asleep." Marin was already asleep, one of the guards mumbled. "That is enough," Mrs. Thornton interrupted, but the concern in her eyes was obvious. A guard named Dylan Hale stepped out. "Maybe she did not intend to steal it," he offered. He held both hands out in the placating gesture of a peacemaker. "Perhaps she just wanted to have a look. It is an extremely valuable watch. Temptation can be a powerful thing." The insinuation hung in the air like a sharp blade. Ara looked straight at him, and in his polite smile, she finally saw the truth. It was the deep satisfaction of a man who had waited a very long time for this moment. The insider was not just opening doors for their enemies. He was actively setting traps right in her path. "Search her room," Ree ordered. Two guards headed down the hall. Ara locked her gaze on Dylan. He stared back, not blinking, challenging her to let her composure slip and show him just how much she understood. They returned much quicker than she had anticipated. One held a black velvet box, which he said was found in her drawer. "Sir?" He opened the box. The watch rested inside, its surface reflecting the ceiling lights, sparkling as if it was proud of the chaos it was creating. "I did not put it there," Ada said, her voice dropping, talking more to herself than to anyone in the room. Planting evidence was the oldest trick in the book, and she was furious with herself for not figuring out Dylan sooner. Reese moved closer, glancing from the watch to her, his jaw clenching. "You are even dumber than I thought," he said quietly. "If you had sold it, that would have at least made some sense. But keeping it in my own house is not about greed. That is an insult. I did not steal it. Someone is framing me." "Of course they are," he shot back. "And I assume this same mysterious person is also behind all of your convenient little accidents these past few months." Her thoughts were racing. If she argued too much, she would seem desperate. If she said nothing, she would be completely ruined. No matter what, the insider won. He was getting rid of the only person who was genuinely protecting the children. "Check the security footage again," she said, forcing her posture to remain slumped instead of defiant. "Zoom in on her walk. It is close, but that is not me. Ask Marin. She knows the way I walk." "We are done here," Ree cut in. "Mrs. Thornton, please prepare her termination papers, effective immediately." From the doorway, a small voice broke the tension. "She did not steal it." Asher was standing there, his hands balled into tight fists, his face pale, but his voice was solid. "She does not even want your things." Marin appeared right behind him, her eyes red, and her small hand darted out to grab Ada's, and she refused to let go. A muscle twitched at the corner of Reese's mouth, but the expression was gone as quickly as it came. "Go to your rooms," he told the children. "This has nothing to do with you." "It does if you are sending away the one person who actually cares about us," Asher retorted. The entire dining room went still. Mrs. Thornton shut her eyes. Dylan barely concealed a smile. Ree looked at his son with an expression Ara could not decipher. It might have been anger, or maybe something much more painful. He turned back. "Hale, please escort Miss Voss to her room. Make sure she finishes packing." Dylan moved forward with just a little too much enthusiasm. "Yes, sir." Ara's instincts were screaming. They did not just want her to leave, they wanted her completely isolated. There was a big difference. But she lowered her head, let her shoulders droop, and fixed her eyes on the floor. "I will pack," she said softly. "I will not cause any more trouble." As she turned to leave, Mrs. Thornton gently pried Marin's fingers from her hand. The little girl's quiet sobbing followed her down the hallway, a fragile connection that Ara did not dare turn back to acknowledge. Dylan walked half a step behind her, so close she could feel his breath on her neck. The penthouse was so silent that their footsteps on the hardwood floors echoed like a countdown. They passed the surveillance room, where the monitors cast a pale blue glow in the darkness. Dylan spoke, his voice low, just for the two of them to hear. "You played a good game, did you not?" She did not turn her head. "Most people only make it 3 months," he continued, his tone conversational, like a coworker offering a compliment after a meeting. "You lasted 8. That is impressive." Ara kept her shoulders slumped, her feet dragging, her eyes glued to the floor. On the inside, every muscle in her body was coiled tight like a spring. "Do not worry about the children," he said, and his voice softened into something almost gentle, the kind of gentleness that comes from someone who enjoys their own cruelty. "There will be a new arrangement, more professional." The phrase "more professional" echoed in Ara's mind, and its ordinary meaning dissolved, revealing the terrifying truth underneath. In Reese Calloway's world, the world of the Serpent Syndicate, the world of the people controlling Dylan Hale, professional did not mean a better nanny, a more qualified teacher, or a safer environment. It meant clean, it meant fast, and it meant leaving no trace behind. It meant that 2 7-year-old children were going to vanish from this penthouse in the dead of night. Reese Calloway would either get a phone call with a long list of demands, or he would get silence. And silence would be the absolute worst answer. They reached her door. Dylan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, that smile still fixed on his face like a lit-up sign someone forgot to turn off. "You have 1 hour," he told her. "2 guards will come to take you to the lobby. Leave your key at the front desk." She placed her hand on the doorknob. "Thank you," she murmured, in the voice of a person who had completely given up. He watched her for a second longer, as if he was looking for any sign, a flicker of rage, a cold stare, anything to prove she was not just the defeated nanny he had outsmarted. But Ada gave him nothing. She went inside and shut the door quietly. She did not slam it, because even the sound of a closing door could give away too much. The room was small, with a single bed, a nightstand, a small closet, and a narrow window that looked out into the empty space between 2 buildings. Her suitcase was sitting half open on the bed, a silent testament to the life she had started to pack up the moment Reese said the word terminated. Now it felt like a dark prediction. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her hands on her knees, and stared at the wall. The silence in the room grew around her like rising floodwaters. Then, she reached down and pulled a tin box from the bottom of her suitcase. One corner was a little more dented from her last move, and the silver paint was chipping off, but the photograph inside was perfectly preserved. 2 children stood in front of the door to their foster home, one wearing a cardboard witch hat and the other a cape made from a black garbage bag. They had the bright smiles of kids who had no idea it would be the last Halloween they would ever experience together. Ara stared at her foster sister's face, and a memory surfaced without her permission. That night at the foster home, the darkness was thick. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hall. The bedroom door creaked open, and the hallway light sliced a bright rectangle across the floor. She was 13, trying to pull the little girl closer, pressing her into the corner and using her own skinny body as a shield. But what good was being 13? She was not strong enough. She was not fast enough. She was not big enough to stop the hands that tore the child from her grasp. And after it was over, when the lights came on and the adults rushed in and someone called for an ambulance, the little girl was just lying on the floor. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with a vacant look that Ada would see in her nightmares for the next 14 years. A tear dropped onto the photograph. Ada did not wipe it away. She let it land, let it seep into the old paper, because it was the first time in 8 months that she had allowed herself to cry. And she needed to feel it. She needed to know that the part of her that could feel was not completely gone, no matter how hard she had tried to numb it. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking without making a sound. It was the kind of crying you learn when you figure out as a child that tears only invite more trouble. Then she made herself stop. Not because the tears were gone, but because in her mind, her foster sister's face blended with Marin's and Asher's. 3 children were looking at her, asking the same unspoken question. Are you going to be there for us? She clutched the photograph tightly. Not this time. She put it back in the tin box, snapped the lid shut, and tucked it into the breast pocket over her heart. Then she got to her feet. She looked down at the black belt she wore around her waist. The fabric was a little frayed at the edges after 8 months of daily wear. She untied it, smoothed it out, and then tied it again, much tighter this time. The knot felt solid, like a promise she was making to herself. Her old plan was finished. She could not pretend to be clumsy and just find a way out of this mess. Dylan had shut that door for good when he planted the watch in her drawer. But she also could not just walk out of the building. Not when something more professional was waiting for the children on the other side of the door she was just thrown out of. She would not leave. She would act obedient, play the part of the defeated woman, and drag her suitcase out with her head down. But she would not get into that elevator. She would wait. And when the time came, when the snake finally revealed itself completely, she would be exactly where she needed to be, right between it and the children. She glanced out the small window. Manhattan glittered below, brilliant and unconcerned. 1 hour, she had 1 hour until they would come for her. She settled onto the edge of the mattress and waited, allowing herself to sit perfectly straight for the first time in 8 months now that no one was looking. But the knock on her door came much earlier than expected. It was not the guards coming to remove her. Instead, it was Mrs. Thornan, whose face was a tense mask, even though her voice remained perfectly steady. Miss Voss, she announced, there has been a change of plans. Miss Bianca has demanded that you serve the guests this evening. It is meant to be a final disgrace before you are shown the door, and the boss is too preoccupied with threats from the syndicate to disagree with her. He needs all hands on deck for service. You will be permitted to leave after the event concludes. Ada met the house manager's gaze. A spark ignited inside her, not hope, but something sharper, like cold math. This gave her more time. The door was not completely shut yet. Yes, ma'am, she replied, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she emerged into the hallway, the penthouse had already transformed. Glasses of red wine seemed to cover every available surface, and crystals shimmered under the light of the grand chandeliers. The guests were a collection of New York City's elite, dressed in expensive suits and designer dresses. The sound of their laughter mixed with the smooth jazz playing from hidden speakers. In the center of the living room, Bianca commanded attention like a queen holding court. She wore a stunning white silk dress, her hair styled in perfect curls, and was beaming at a man Ara was certain had never appeared on any security list. Ara paused and observed the scene. She moved through the party carrying a tray of appetizers, with her shoulders slumped and her eyes on the floor, a ghost among the beautiful people. The man chatting with Bianca was about 40, dressed in a sharp gray suit. He had an easy smile, but when he thought no one was looking, his gaze shifted to the emergency exit map on the wall. He studied it for just 2 seconds before snapping his attention back to the conversation. Ara set down one tray and picked up another, and in that brief moment, everything clicked. Dylan did not need to get Marin out of the penthouse himself. He was using Bianca, and Bianca had no idea. She just thought she was taking her niece to a fancy late-night party with a charming new friend. The very same man who was now memorizing the escape routes. It was a perfect plan, quiet and clean, with no weapons needed. Just a clueless aunt and a getaway car waiting downstairs. When Bianca clapped her hands and announced that she and Marin were leaving for another party, Ara knew she only had minutes. She scanned the room. Ree was talking with two men by the window, but his eyes kept flicking back to Ara, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Dylan stood by the elevator, watching everything, waiting. The night shift bodyguard was near the door holding a glass of water. He was relaxed by the party atmosphere. Marin sat on the couch, kicking her feet back and forth. She was wearing the dress Bianca had given her, looking like a tiny doll in a world of grown-ups. Ara did not have many options. She could not just tell them the truth. She could not grab Marin and run without being stopped. But she could do the one thing she had spent 8 months mastering. She picked up a tray holding 3 full glasses of red wine and walked toward Bianca with her usual clumsy stride. As she passed, she calculated the distance, the angle, and the speed. The tray's edge grazed Bianca's elbow, just enough to make one glass wobble. Then a second one tipped. And then red wine spilled all over the white silk dress like blood on fresh snow. Bianca's shriek sliced through the music. She slapped Ara across the face, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. But as Bianca raised her hand to strike again, Ara's fingers shot out and clamped around her wrist in midair. Her slumped shoulders straightened, and her nervous twitch disappeared. From the hallway, Ree Calloway stepped forward, stunned at the sight of the woman he had made fun of for 8 months, holding his sister's wrist in an iron grip. Ara's voice was low and firm. "We do not do that here, Miss Calloway." Just then, the private elevator chimed, and the doors opened to reveal pure chaos. Bodyguards reached for their weapons. Mrs. Thornton dove behind the sofa, pulling Bianca down with her as the woman stood frozen, red wine still dripping down her dress. Guests screamed and scrambled toward the windows, as if the bulletproof glass could protect them. Ree reached for his phone and cursed, but Ara did not run for cover. She ran forward. "Asher! Marin!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Under the bed! Count to 100, just like we practiced!" From down the hall, she heard the faint sound of little feet running and a bedroom door slamming shut. She knew the children had heard her. 8 months of playing games about counting exits, 8 months of turning drills about finding hiding spots into fun, had all led to this very moment. 6 gunmen fanned out across the living room, moving like a well-trained unit. Their tactical boots hit the stone floor with a steady rhythm. Dylan Hale was the last one to step out of the elevator. He wore no mask. The friendly smile he always had was gone, replaced by a look as cold and sharp as a brand-new blade. "Your father's security has expired, Calloway," he announced, his voice easily carrying over the screams. Ara stepped directly into his path. The first gunman aimed his rifle at her. But before he could fire, she had already closed the gap between them, using the glass coffee table as a launch pad. Her foot came down on the table, propelling her into the air, and she slammed her other foot directly into his chest. He staggered backward into the man behind him, and they both went down in a heap of tangled arms and legs. The living room instantly became a war zone. Glass shattered, furniture splintered, and the carefully designed elegance of the penthouse was torn to shreds by sudden violence. Ara moved through the mayhem like she was born in it. A man charged at her with a knife. She grabbed his wrist and twisted until she heard a crack. The knife clattered to the floor. Without even a glance, she kicked it under the couch. A third attacker came at her with a heavy tactical baton, the kind that could easily break bones. She ducked under his swing, grabbed the front of his shirt, and used his own momentum to throw him straight through the glass coffee table. It exploded into 1,000 tiny pieces, and he lay motionless in the wreckage. Behind her, one of Ree's bodyguards shot down another attacker. The other bodyguard was shot in the leg. His knee gave out and his gun fell from his hand. Ara scooped it up in one fluid motion, spinning around just as a fifth gunman raised his weapon. She did not aim to kill. She shot him in the hand. The gun went flying from his shattered fingers, and he screamed, gripping his wrist as blood poured out. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of blood as broken glass continued to settle. Across the room, Dylan walked with a strange sense of calm, moving through the destruction as if he were taking a Sunday stroll in the park. He had his gun out and was heading for the hallway that led to the children's rooms. He paused by the sofa where Ree was hiding and aimed his gun down. "You should have just let us take the children quietly," he said. "Now things are going to get messy." Ara stepped right between them. She raised her gun, aiming the barrel straight at Dylan's heart. "Funny," she said, her voice steady and cold, without the slightest hint of the stutter he used to hear. "I was about to say the same thing to you." Dylan laughed. "You are good, I will give you that. Much better than the usual security. But you are still outnumbered." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you sure about that?" The remaining gunmen were trying to rally. Two were already down. Another was leaning against a pillar, holding a bleeding shoulder. Ree's bodyguards, now fully aware of the situation, were working together, covering the angles she left open, trusting her to handle the rest. The odds were still not great, but they were no longer impossible. Dylan's gaze flickered toward the children's hallway, then to the sparkling pieces of a broken watch scattered on the floor. "Alive is worth more money," he muttered. "But if I have to bring you and the kids back in body bags—" He shifted his gun just slightly toward the hallway, toward the bedroom where two 7-year-old children were hiding under a bed, counting to 100. Ara fired. The bullet tore through Dylan's shoulder, spinning him around. His own gun went off, shooting a hole in the ceiling and sending down a shower of plaster. He crashed into the glass railing, his face a mask of pain and shock. "You," he gasped. "Never touch what you can't protect," she replied. Dylan slid down the railing, smearing blood across the glass. But he laughed, a rough, wet sound. "You think you have won," he said. "Serpent never quits. This is just the beginning." "Maybe," Ara said, walking closer. "But you will not be here to see what happens next." He raised his gun with a trembling arm, the barrel slowly coming up as his fingers searched for the trigger. A single gunshot rang out. Dylan's eyes widened in surprise. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his shirt, then back at Ara, not with anger, but with confusion. She had not fired. Behind her, Ree Calloway lowered his own gun, breathing heavily. His shirt was stained with old blood and new dust. He had moved without anyone noticing, completely silent in his own home for the first time. It was a perfect shot. Dylan's knees buckled. He slid the rest of the way down the railing, leaving a long streak of blood, and then he was still. A deep silence settled over the room, like snow falling on a battlefield. First, the shooting stopped. Then, the sounds of pain faded as the bodyguards moved through the room, using zip ties to secure the remaining attackers. They gathered up all the weapons and placed them in neat piles on the floor. Soon, the only sound was the soft crackle of shattered glass finding its final resting place on the marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and iron. Ara stood in the center of the wreckage, her chest rising and falling as she forced her breathing to calm down. A shallow cut on her right arm was bleeding through her gray uniform, but she did not look at it. Her eyes scanned the room one last time. The threat was gone. Her allies were safe. There was no more movement. Then she turned her back on the chaos and walked toward the hallway. Her steps were faster than usual, her bare feet hitting the wood floor with a steady, urgent rhythm. When she got to Marin's bedroom door, she fell to her knees, her knees met the cold floor. With a steady hand, she knocked 3 times, soft, even taps, with a single breath between each one. It was the signal she had taught the children 2 months in, framed as a secret game. They had practiced it until both Asher and Marin could pick her distinct knockout from any other sound in the world. After a moment, she heard a faint shuffle from the other side of the door. It was the whisper of a blanket being dragged across wood, followed by the careful padding of small feet. The door creaked open, and Marin launched herself out like a small rocket, her tiny arms locking around Lara's neck with a force that nearly stole her breath. The little girl was crying silently, her entire body trembling in Lara's embrace as hot tears soaked the gray fabric of her shoulder. No sound escaped her, just the quiet shaking of a 7-year-old who had learned too early that survival depended on silence. Lara clutched Marin with one arm and reached her other hand toward the doorway. Asher appeared right behind his sister. His eyes were red but completely dry, and his mouth was a thin, hard line. His small fists were clenched at his sides. He did not cry. He did not run. He walked toward her with the rigid control of someone using every ounce of will to not fall to pieces. His small hand found her wrist and squeezed with the desperate strength of a boy afraid that if he let her go, she would disappear like smoke. "I counted to 87, he whispered, his voice raspy. "Then I heard you knock." "I told you I would come," Lara said softly. The three of them were a small huddle on the hallway floor. Marin was still clinging to her, Asher was gripping her wrist, and Lara held them both, her own arms trembling from the last traces of adrenaline and something much deeper she refused to name. Further down the hall, in the destroyed living room, Ree Calloway stood in the wreckage of the life he had so carefully constructed. Shards of glass crunched under his expensive shoes, blood stained the rug, and furniture was thrown everywhere. And 20 paces away, his two children were clinging to the nanny he had dismissed as stupid. The nanny he had fired. The nanny he had almost tossed onto the street just an hour ago. They ran to her, not to him. In 20 years in the criminal underworld, no bullet had ever wounded him as deeply as that single moment. He started walking, his feet stepping on broken glass without him even noticing, and he stopped just a few feet away from them. The gun was still in his hand, its barrel pointed at the floor. His finger was off the trigger, but he hadn't yet let go. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low. It was not an accusation, but a full admission of his failure. Lara looked up. Marin stayed hidden, her face pressed into Lara's shoulder, not ready to face anything but the safety of gray cloth. "You would not have listened," she replied. There was no anger in her voice, no hint of blame, only a plain and simple truth that could not be argued with. Rhys stood there, a gun in his hand while his children took comfort in another's arms. He said nothing, because he knew she was right. And for the first time in his 36 years, the truth left him with absolutely nothing to say. After the paramedics bandaged her arm and the police took down a story that left out far more than it included, Lara went back to her small room at the end of the hall. The door clicked shut, and her world shrank to just 4 walls, a single bed, a nightstand, and a narrow window that looked out on the dark space between 2 skyscrapers. Her suitcase was still on the bed, half packed from before the world had shattered. The clothes inside were neatly folded, a reminder that an hour ago she was the woman being kicked out, not the woman who had just saved everyone in the house. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she walked over and continued packing. Her movements were automatic. She folded each shirt and every pair of pants into precise squares, as if the order inside her luggage could somehow restore the order that had been lost just outside her door. She unbuckled the black belt from her waist. After 8 months of daily wear, the fabric was slightly frayed along the edges, and the knot had permanently molded itself to the unique way she tied it. Holding the weight of every time she had cinched it tight before going out to be someone else. She smoothed the fabric over the bedspread, her fingers stopping at the center crease. For a heartbeat, she wasn't sure if she was putting it away for good or just packing it for the next job. Then, she knelt and took the small tin box from the pocket over her heart. A corner was a little more dented now. Maybe it happened when she dove over the coffee table. Or maybe when she held Marin so close in the hall. She lifted the lid. The photograph inside was more faded than it was 8 months ago. Or maybe she was just seeing it with different eyes. 2 kids stood on the porch of the foster home. One wore a cardboard witch hat, the other, a cape made from a black garbage bag. They were smiling. This time no one died. She whispered the words, just for herself. This time no one died. The mission was over. The Serpent Syndicate was broken from the inside. Dylan was on the living room floor under a white sheet. But the children were safe, still breathing, still old enough to count to 87. She could zip the suitcase, walk to the elevator, and vanish into the city. She could go back to what she had always been, a shadow who took a job, finished it, and left. No real home, no one to miss her, no one to remember her. Was supposed to leave. She laid the picture on the folded clothes in the suitcase and reached for the zipper. That's when she heard the tiny footsteps outside her door. They weren't the heavy tread of a guard or the sharp click of Mrs. Thornton's heels. They were light, unsure, and they paused right at her door, as if the person on the other side couldn't decide whether to knock. A single tap followed, so soft it was almost imaginary. Alara opened the door. Marin was standing there in star-patterned pajamas that were much too big for her. The sleeves fell past her hands, her eyes were puffy, her nose was red, and her hair was a tangled mess from the fight. In her right hand, she gripped the old teddy bear with the frayed ear that she had held onto ever since her mom passed away. Her left hand just hung there, clenching and unclenching, like she was practicing how to hold something she was afraid would disappear. "You promised you wouldn't leave," Marin said. She wasn't crying. It was something worse. It was the flat voice of a child who expected adults to break their promises and was just trying not to be surprised by it again. Alara looked at that little face, and every defense she had built over 14 years, every shield, every rule about not getting close, every reminder that she was a weapon, not a person, it all crumbled. Not with a crash, but in a quiet, complete surrender. She knelt, down to the floor, her arms wrapped around Marin, pulling the small girl against her chest. Marin hugged her back just as tightly, crushing the teddy bear between them as she buried her face in Alara's shoulder. And then, the little girl finally let herself cry, her small body shaking with sobs that came in waves. Alara's own tears fell onto Marin's hair. She didn't try to stop them. She didn't wipe them away. For the first time in 14 years, since that awful night at the foster home, since she was 13 years old and holding her foster sister's cooling body, Ilara cried in front of another person. She let it happen because the child in her arms needed to see that grown-ups were allowed to hurt. That crying didn't make you weak, and staying wasn't about a job, but about something more real. She did not know how long they stayed like that before she sensed someone else was there. He stood just inside the doorway, where the dark of the hall met the light of the room. Asher was there, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. His mouth was a thin, hard line, and his eyes were red but completely dry. Not because he was being strong, but because he was using every bit of his will to hold himself together. He didn't come into the room. He just stood on the edge, watching, and Alara understood. The boy was terrified. Not of the dark or guns or bad guys. He was afraid that if he came in and also asked her to stay, she would only do it out of guilt or obligation, not because she actually wanted to. For a 7-year-old boy who had lost his mother and had a father who confused control with love, being wanted out of pity was even worse than being left behind. Alara looked at him over Marin's head. Her eyes were still wet, and she made no effort to hide it. She held out one hand toward him, palm up. It wasn't a demand, just an open, waiting invitation. Asher stared at her hand, then at her eyes, then back down at his own clenched fists. Then, the boy moved forward, taking one small, rigid step after another, as if each one was a price he could never get back. He let her pull him in, his arms wrapping around both her and Marin in a fierce hug. His head was bowed, his forehead pressed against her shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The three of them sat together on the floor of that small room, lit only by the soft yellow light of a lamp, inside a penthouse that still smelled like smoke and broken glass. No one spoke. They just held on. And in that moment, Alara knew she was not going to close that suitcase. The children slept in her bed that night. Marin was curled up in the middle with her teddy bear held close, her breathing finally calm and even. Asher lay on the edge of the bed with his back to the room, but even in his sleep, his hand had reached out and was clutching the hem of Ilara's shirt. She sat in the chair next to the bed and just watched over them, not sleeping, not even trying to, just waiting until the darkness in the room felt safe again. After their breathing was deep and steady, she stood up. She gently pried Asher's fingers from her shirt, tucked the blanket around them both, and slipped out into the hallway. She leaned her back against the wall, closed her eyes, and took the first real breath she'd taken all night. The air still tasted of gunpowder, mixed with the sharp smell of the cleaning chemicals the staff had used to scrub the floors. She heard heavy footsteps down the hall, slow and unsure in a way that Reese Calloway never was. She opened her eyes. He was standing about 10 steps away, and he was alone. No Mrs. Thornton, no bodyguards. For the first time since she had met him, there was no one with him. He was just a man in a wrinkled white shirt covered in plaster dust, with the sleeves rolled up. A patch of dried blood on his cuff had turned a dark brown. He seemed smaller, not because he had actually shrunk, but because he was no longer trying to fill up every inch of space around him. He walked toward her and stopped at her doorway. He peered through the open door into the room, his eyes taking in the open suitcase, the black belt on the bed, and the two children sleeping under the covers. He saw all of it, and then he looked directly at her. "I was wrong about you," he said. His voice was quiet and plain, with no attempt to soften the words or dance around what he meant. The 4 words landed in the silence of the hallway like coins hitting stone. "About a lot of things," she replied. He gave a slow, heavy nod, the kind that carried the weight of a pride that was finally cracking. He didn't say he was sorry. She didn't expect him to. He stood in the doorway of her room, a man used to commanding entire ballrooms, looking lost in the small frame. The way he stood there, not quite straight, with his shoulders slumped just a little, his gaze meeting hers without challenging it, that was his apology. It wasn't in his words, but in his presence, in the shared silence that became a confession. Then he spoke again, and his tone shifted. It wasn't softer, but it was more direct. It was the voice of a man who had finally dropped his defenses because he was too tired to hold them up anymore. "My father hired you." She didn't deny it. "He loves his grandchildren more than he loves his son." Reese took a sharp breath. "I know." A moment passed between them. Then he said, "I don't want you to stay as their nanny. To call you that after tonight would be a joke. I want you to stay as what you really are. The head of security, the one who protects my children, my partner." The word seemed foreign in his mouth, a word a man who only gives orders would never have a reason to say. But he said it, and he let it hang in the air between them. Ilara looked at him. She thought of the dark study in Connecticut, of the old man entrusting his grandchildren to a stranger. She thought of the safe house in Brooklyn, of the sound of shattering plates, and of the Halloween photo in her tin box. She remembered the fear on the guards' faces when she had stopped Bianca's hand, and how that fear turned to relief when she took control. She thought of Asher counting the exits on a city street, of Marin holding her wrist while she slept, and of the cup of coffee left for her on a morning when she almost let herself feel at home. She had known for years that protection was more than just strength, but standing there, in a hallway still smelling of a battle, looking at a man who was finally lowering his own weapon, not because he was defeated but because he had chosen to, she understood it in a new way. Lower his gaze, she understood the rest. True protection was not about hiding. It was about standing your ground and being exactly who you are, without any pretense, without putting on a show, without the slumped shoulders or the stutter. He offered his hand. It was not the hand that handled money, nor the one that signed termination notices, but simply an open hand, waiting. She looked at it. The long fingers, the calluses in his palm from a trigger, a new scrape across the back from tonight's fight. It was the hand of a man who had killed, who had built an empire, who had lost a wife, and had nearly lost his children. The hand was offered now, not from a place of power, but because he had no other words to say that he needed her. She took it. "Partners," she said. His grip tightened. "Partners," he replied, but she did not pull her hand away. She held on a moment longer, her fingers closing around his, just enough for him to feel the strength she had concealed for 8 months. "If anyone in this house," she said, her voice quiet but firm, her eyes locked on his, "ever raises a hand to anyone else here, you included, I will neutralize that threat faster than any mobster could reach those elevator doors." He looked at her, the most feared man on the East Coast, and saw the nanny in the blood-spattered gray uniform for who she truly was for the first time. Instead of fear, a corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a smile. It was something closer to an admission that he had lost this particular battle long before he even knew it was being fought. "Noted," he said. Their hands parted, but something between them held fast. Something delicate, fragile, and new. It was not trust, not yet. It was not anything that could be named, but it was real, and it was a beginning. Late into the night, the penthouse had been cleaned up, but the scars remained. A long scratch marred the marble floor where the coffee table had been thrown. A crack ran up the base of the pillar near the elevator. A faint stain of blood lingered at the edge of the rug, a spot the cleaners had scrubbed 3 times, but could not fully erase. It was as if the apartment itself wanted to preserve the evidence, to remind everyone that tonight had really happened. The shattered windows were replaced with temporary boards, but the metal frames were still bent. And when the night wind pushed against the tower, the building let out a low, unfamiliar moan. Ara stood before the living room's wall of glass, looking down at Manhattan spread out below. The Hudson River moved like black oil in the darkness, its surface reflecting a million lights into a ribbon of sparkling silk that stretched to the horizon. The city did not sleep, it did not stop, and it did not care what had just occurred on the 62nd floor of a skyscraper in its heart. It kept on turning. It always does. The black belt around her waist had been retied, the knot pulled securely, the material warm from her body. She could feel its steady, familiar weight with each breath. But tonight, it signified something new. It was no longer the secret tether to her real self, maintained through 8 months of acting a part. Now, it was just a piece of who she was, no longer hidden, no longer requiring any explanation. The soft padding of little footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Marin emerged from the hallway, barefoot, still dressed in her oversized pajamas with stars on them. Her hair was tangled and her eyes were puffy, but she had stopped crying. The little girl did not say a word. She just walked over, took Ara's left hand, wove her 5 tiny fingers into Ara's palm, squeezed gently, and stayed right there. A few seconds later, another set of footsteps followed. Asher appeared behind his sister. His hair was just as messy, his eyes just as red, but he stood tall. He walked to Ara's other side and took her available hand. There was no need for words. Nobody had told him to go to her. He came because that was where he wanted to be. The 3 of them gazed out at the city in silence. Lights blinked from the buildings across the river. Traffic moved in lines of tiny bright spots below, and a helicopter flew across the sky, its faint mechanical drone slowly dissolving into the night. "Will you teach us more games?" Asher asked, his eyes still fixed on the glass. "Not games," Ara said gently. "Skills. How to see danger before it finds you. How to stand your ground when it's already there." "Like you did with our dad," the boy said. "Exactly. Minus the slapping part, though." "I hope so," Marin giggled. And that small sound, in a home that had just been filled with gunfire and shattering glass, was the closest thing to a miracle Ara had ever heard. In the darkness of the hallway behind them, Reese Calloway stood leaning against the wall. She did not turn around, but she knew he was there. She could feel his presence just as she had learned to feel everything in the penthouse over the last 8 months. By instinct, by a shift in the air, by the change in breathing within a room. He stood there, and for the very first time, he did not issue a command. He did not exert control. He did not step forward to claim ownership of the moment. He simply stayed in the shadows and watched the three figures by the glass wall, allowing that moment to belong to them. Maybe that was as close as a man like Reese Calloway could ever get to showing love. Arda took a deep breath. She felt the weight of the black belt around her waist, the warmth of two small hands holding hers, and the hard corner of the tin box in her pocket pressing against her chest with every heartbeat. And she realized, slowly, the way the sun rises instead of a light being flipped on, that she finally possessed something she had never had in her 27 years. A place to come home to. It was not a street address, not a building, but the feeling of hands that held on to hers and did not let go when everything else was falling to pieces. Outside, the city kept moving. There would be more enemies, more challenges, and more nights when the line between being safe and facing disaster was as thin as a single thread. But she was done hiding. She was done pretending to be clumsy. She was done hunching her shoulders and lowering her eyes and faking a stammer so the world would look right past her. She was standing exactly where she was meant to stand, with the exact people she was meant to protect. And for the first time in her life, she did not have to pretend to be someone else in order to belong. If you have stayed with this story all the way to the very end, thank you. This story is meant to share one idea. That real strength is not found in a fist or a gun, but in where you choose to stand when everything falls apart, who you choose to protect when you have nothing left to protect yourself with, and how you choose to stay when it would be so much easier to leave. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one that no one ever takes the time to notice. Sometimes love does not show up in words, but in a cup of coffee left outside your door at 6 in the morning, in 3 soft knocks in the dark, in a tiny hand that takes yours and refuses to let go. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone who quietly protected you and never received a thank you, or if it reminded you that you also possess a strength the world has not yet seen, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs this story tonight, and subscribe to our channel so you do not miss the new stories we bring to you every day. We would truly love to know how you felt, which moment made you cry, and which character brought to mind someone in your own life. Please write it in the comments so we can listen, because every story is only truly complete when it is shared from one heart to another. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Thank you for spending this time here with us. Goodbye, and I will see you in the next video. Model. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.